for everybody who's joined us, my name's Sally. I'm from the Global EverGreening Alliance, and you've arrived at our book club. And for the last month and a half, we've been reading a fabulous book by the author Judith D. Schwartz, who we now have with us. Sorry, that was a mouthful. The author of Cows Save the Planet, and more recently, The Reindeer Chronicles. Congratulations on that. But for the last month and a half, we've been reading Water in Plain Sight, which truly is a super book, Judy, and not at all what I was expecting, I would have to say. I think I was talking to you about this the other day. If a book is super sciencey, then I definitely can't get through it. But this book it's fantastic because it's full of, meeting people around the planet, traveling. There's a quote on the back that really spoke to me about how, especially during this time with the pandemic, it's like traveling around the world in your armchair and meeting people as you go, going to Africa, coming to Australia, going to Mexico, and with so many other stops along the way and really interesting people. But what about you and your experience and your background led you to write an entire book?
This came after writing a book about soil. And so a couple of things after writing a book about soil was that whenever people talked about water, it was a matter, the way that people talked about it was that it was a matter of what did or didn't come down from the sky. And, having been thinking about soil for all this time, it was very clear to me that it had so much to do with how we treat the land. And yet that hadn't been part of our conversation. Basically, we can't really talk about water unless we're also talking about land. And we can think about soil as our best water infrastructure. So that's really what motivated me. So this was around the time, I know that Australia, you have your own trajectory in terms of droughts and all that. But here in the US, we were focused on the California drought, and land wasn't mentioned. Land degradation wasn't even part of the conversation. And yet I knew that it was so much part of the story. So that's what led me to write this book. And then one other kind of important thing was that when we talk about the connection between water and climate, it only went in one direction, namely that climate change will put added stress on water resources around the world. But no one was looking at the effect of water on climate and how we can work with the water cycle to promote nature's cooling processes. So those were the two big motivators for me.
So this is a really broad question. Is there enough water? With all the current concerns about water usage and lack of water and
there's always the same quantity of water. I mean, it just changes form and it changes where it is. So fresh water is a challenge, largely because we keep polluting it. So that's one challenge. And we're mining our groundwater resources. So we would do best to take better care of stewarding our water. Just as an example, in agriculture, I think about 70% of the world's water use is in agriculture. And yet water's just used as if it were infinite. Whereas for this book, the new book, The Reindeer Chronicles, I tell the story about someone who is working in Western Saudi Arabia, where it is extremely dry, and there may not be a significant rainfall in 3 years. But he was very careful when it rained, to to harvest that water, to hold that water so it could be used, and making sure never to go into water debt. In other words, never to use more water than had been harvested. And the incredible thing about this story is that when it rained, they planted trees, and they planted thousands of trees, and they used the water that they had held. And then the irrigation, well, but basically what happened was that in 2016, the project ran out of funds. So they had to stop the irrigation. And they thought, oh no, what's going to happen? I mean, all that work that they put in and all those trees and all that. And 80% of the trees survived because they had developed such a system.
Wow.
I mean, a tree is not just a tree. A tree is part of a community of other trees, a community of microorganisms, of fungi, and all using the resources of sunlight and water and air and nutrients. And they had built a working system, and it survived. Mm-hmm.
That's incredible. In Saudi Arabia. So that kind of challenges the idea that a lot of people have, that trees will grow where it's wet and where there's rainfall. But maybe this
Well,
is a
that's a
chicken and egg
really, really interesting
situation.
way of putting it, because one could also say, and scientists that I speak to have made the point, that where there are trees, there is water, and including rainfall. So trees hold the soil, which can then hold the water. Trees in themselves embody huge amounts of water. I mean, you think about the moisture that's traveling up and down the trunk and being emitted through the leaves, and all the biomass has water in it. But it is really, really compelling as we begin to understand the role of forests in driving rainfall. So this is a theory called the biotic pump.
Mm.
Basically, it draws on the understanding that plants are always transpiring, and transpiring means that the water is moving upward and out through the leaves, and this creates a kind of low pressure zone, which creates a vacuum which pulls moisture towards these trees, towards the forest. And the people who developed this theory felt that this was a way to explain why it rains inland. So, because it makes sense that there's moisture at the coast, but then how does that moisture move inland? And we've learned that that moisture from transpiration constitutes much, like 90% of our rainfall. So plants are moving all that moisture around. When I finished writing this book, I began to feel that plants run the show. I didn't expect to feel that way, but plants are moving energy, they're moving heat, they're moving water. Actually, there's a quote from one of your country people, Peter Andrews, who in one of his books, he developed natural sequence farming. He says that plants manage water, and in managing water, they are managing heat. So there you've got the rainfall, you've got moisture, and you've got climate, kind of all in that little package of a plant.
And you talked about this biotic pump. You related that to a story about
Right.
the
Right.
Amazon
Yeah.
forest,
So,
didn't
I mean,
you?
it's kind of really hard
Mm.
to grapple with now because there's so much destruction in the Amazon rainforest, but we can certainly talk about how it works. And also there's an interesting story that
Mm.
Rio de Janeiro in the 1800s had like so much of the forest in that region had been cut down, and the city lost its water. And then a naturalist said, well, why don't we plant trees and the water will return? And it did. So that was an example right there. But yeah, in terms of the Amazon rainforest, there is a river of moisture moving above the forest that has as much water or moisture in it as the Amazon River itself. So yeah, so yeah, there's more attention
Wow.
to these kinds of aerial rivers that are moving across the planet. And what happens in one area, like if one region is deforested, it may actually have an effect thousands of miles away. But certainly in the Amazon, that moisture is circulating constantly in a kind of localized water cycle, water system. And we need those trees to be there. Those trees need to be there in order for that to continue.
I think there was somewhere in your book where you mentioned that what somebody is doing in Portugal can affect the outcome of what
Right,
a
right.
farmer
And
is trying to grow in
some
Kenya.
research that I did for this new book, there's a really interesting scientist named Mian in Spain, and he's been studying the Western Mediterranean. And he's been doing this for decades. Basically, that there were some data in the 1980s that didn't fit the usual pattern, so we looked into it. And he was able to determine that deforestation along the coast, the covering up of the marshes for development, those those factors combined led to the loss of the daily summer rains that had just always been part of their weather system. And it's because in order to create a rain, they needed that extra transpiration. The moisture moving from the Mediterranean wasn't enough to make a rainfall. I know I laugh thinking to make a rain, but yeah. And then he said that that's also associated with huge downpours in Central Europe because it's almost like a traffic jam of cloud. When the clouds can't release the rain, they kind of hang around up there and then get moved, and so elsewhere you can get really, really heavy rains. Exactly.
Wow, there's a lot happening
Yeah,
where we
and one of
can't
the
see
things
it.
just to add is that water vapor is
Mm.
really
Um,
hard to model and hard to measure. So just one of the things that many of my sources say is that we focus on carbon because it's easier to measure, but water is where so much heat energy is moved around.
mm. It's amazing. For anyone who's just joined, this is the Global Evergreening Alliance's book club, and we're talking to Judith D. Schwartz about her book, Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World. And one of the things that stood out in this book, Judy, was all the people that we meet and how well we get to know them. And they keep popping up again through this story so that their initial story will then connect into somebody else on an entirely different continent. But like from reading the book, I feel like I know a lot about Alan Savory's feet. I know a lot of details about people, and I put a marker in my book and it says
Oh,
Jim
oh, that's so
Laurie,
sweet.
I
I like
like
him
him.
too.
That's what it says. um, Oh, well, can you tell us a bit about him? Because I suspect one of the reasons I might like him so much is because of his love of beavers and how it ties in with your ideas about
right. So
the
Jim Laurie
speed
is
at
a
which water
really,
should
really
travel.
interesting character. And I meet a lot of people like this who really they devote their lives to kind of studying nature and sharing their knowledge. So his main work for a long time has been teaching homeschooled students in Massachusetts about ecology. And the insights that he gives these students are just brilliant and quirky. And he's just very giving. So that's why I smile when you say you like him. Yeah, so he loves talking about just how the land works. And so I'll walk around with him and he'll point out and he'll say, oh, there used to be beaver here now, or even there used to be some kind of shellfish, and he'll know the history. But beavers are they're just such an incredible animal. First of all, they're very cute and shiny, and they do extraordinary things. So, like many animals that do extraordinary things, they're often considered pests because when humans want certain areas of land, say for farming, and then a beaver says, you know what, this wants to be a wetland. This is going to be a wetland. Like there could be a little argument there. But the thing about beavers is that they create moist areas, these wetlands, and by their chewing trees, they build dams, and that holds the water or allows for the water to move more slowly, which means that the water infiltrates and it creates these very, very rich, just very rich soil that can grow things and support so much life. So when beavers are creating these areas of incredible moisture and little estuaries, little kind of little enclaves of water, those areas are perfect for fish to like fish nurseries, for like small fish to kind of get their bearings before they move into larger rivers. Just a little quiet place where they can feed and grow strong and then move on to the next phase of their lives. And then in terms of slowing the water down, it's helpful to understand. So we're in a situation now where we have a lot of flooding in different places. And one way to understand that is that the way that we have developed our landscapes is we've created a situation where the water moves really quickly. So I wrote about that when I was visiting friends in Southern California, which is full of highways, concrete, large homes, and all of that. And so, when it rains, where's the water going to go? It just goes whoosh. It just goes over the parking lot, through the roads and out into the ocean. And the water doesn't have a chance to do the work that water wants to do, which is to nourish more life and to keep moisture in the soil. So the beavers are part of that. If we paid attention to beavers, we could say, oh, okay, water wants to move slowly. That's interesting. Let's see what that's all about. Actually, as I said that, I was talking exactly like my friend Jim Laurie. He would he would say, yeah, water wants to do this. What's that about? See, you've kind of channeled him, you've conjured him up.
Yes, I think I would like him a lot. Now, I know that we've probably only got another 20 minutes or so before Instagram decides to pull the plug on us. So I just wanted to see if any questions had come through for you. While I'm waiting to see, I saw one go past myself, and it was someone asking, of all the stories that you tell in Water in Plain Sight, and you do tell a lot of like fantastic little micro stories. Which is your favorite
Oh
to
my
tell
gosh, is
and
that a
why? I saw
fair
that come in
question?
from
Okay,
Katerina.
well, I have to choose. Okay, so you mentioned
Oh.
Alan Savory. Okay, I will share a little bit about Alan Savory. So he is a wildlife biologist. He's in his 80s now, and he's seen a lot of life. And his passion is wildlife in Southern Africa. He's from Zimbabwe, and he's there now, actually. He usually goes back and forth between the US and Zimbabwe, but right now there's no back and forth. um, he made some very pivotal insights about how animals interact with landscapes. And he came to these insights because he was trying to understand why the land was degrading in his beloved home turf, because he loved all the wild animals, the elephants and zebras and giraffes and wildebeest and all these creatures. And he came to understand that that the the relationship between predators and prey had been disrupted because of human development and human decisions. And he came to understand that predators on the landscape kept animals on the move, and those animals on the move were having a very important impact on the landscape. I mean, actually, basically creating the grasslands. The behavior of these animals on the land was creating the conditions for a variety of grasslands to thrive and for the soil to be very deep and rich so as to support those grasses. So I had a chance to spend more than a week with Alan in Zimbabwe, and I will say that that was absolutely extraordinary, because this is someone who can read a landscape like no one I have ever met. He can look at the way that the the brush is moved, and he'll say a giraffe was here yesterday. He can look at just the most minute changes, and he'll see just different birds and different points in their life cycle, and he can explain why the tree looks like this and why they're there or why they're not there. And just such a rich engagement with nature is so inspiring, and his incredible ease among animals. There was an elephant that he was very close to. It's very, very sad because, and anyway, it's very sad that this elephant is no longer with us, but she was an orphan, and that's a really, really difficult thing. Elephants, there's a lot of poaching, and so sometimes a mother elephant is taken, and then there's a baby elephant. So they raised her and had her around for a good more than 10 years. But what happened to her is that she became too attached to her caregiver, the person who kept, who watched over her. And then when he wasn't there because he needed to be elsewhere, she got very upset, and an upset elephant is very difficult. So people, there wasn't, someone got hurt. Anyway, I can't believe I'm talking about this, but it's real. I mean, these are people living in the African bush, and you get attached to animals. And, as I was saying with Alan, is that he has just a real ease with animals. And a friend of mine who also know him said that he's seen by the animals, which I think is a really interesting way to put it, is that, there's this mutual understanding. So anyway, that was an incredible trip. I got to see how managing the livestock in a holistic way revived this landscape from just being real wasteland. People thought nothing could be done with this, but they brought a river back. And that has meant a fabulous habitat for lots of animals. So the biodiversity has been going up, and also they're working with impoverished villages. We went to visit a few villages, which was deeply humbling, because these people are, many of them are, you know, they're very remote, and they're often dependent on international food aid, but working with the Africa Center, working on how to move the animals around. In their case, it wasn't, you know, large movements and large herds, but they gathered all of their cattle and goats and sheep together as one herd, so that everyone's garden got some impact from the animals, managed impact. And that meant the difference with these communities between being on food aid, being dependent, or being food self-sufficient. And these people were very proud of what they have been able to accomplish. And again, this is life and death.
Bringing back a river is it's a bit of a major thing to achieve, and it actually ties in with another question that somebody asked. Liz has asked about how trees can bring back streams and springs. So bringing back a
Yes,
river,
because
do these
everything ties
questions
in with
tie in
everything
together?
else. So, yeah. So, there are many, many factors. One is by slow, like creatures, whether it's the beaver that we talked about, or in the Western United States and Mexico, prairie dogs, or any life that's in the soil, and plant matter and all of that. And the richer the soil, the more it holds water. It's slowing water down. So it's able to collect enough water to become a body of water, as opposed to swiftly leaving the landscape. So that I'm just thinking of landscapes that I've seen on different ranches and in those ranching areas, where you might see a gully, and maybe that runs as a river for like a few days after a big rainfall, but then is dry the rest of the year. So it's a matter of holding the water, slowing it down, and giving it, I mean, what just occurred to me was giving it work to do. Give give water a chance to nourish some life. You know, when it's concrete, there's nothing for the water to do. It just leaves, nothing to hold it. I hope that answers. But actually, another factor in bringing back the river in Zimbabwe was that the banks had been eroded because cattle were grazing on the banks, because that was really nice. That's a nice place for a cow to hang out, because it has the water, it has stuff to nibble on. But they made sure that the banks were not overgrazed, that the plants on the banks of the river had a chance to revive and hold the soil in place. So it was also using the animals in a planned way that allowed the river to come back. Because if you have erosion, then everything silts up, and yeah, it doesn't, the river doesn't hold its shape.
Because you actually write a lot about soil when it comes to water, and making the soil ready to receive water. So you compare it to crumbly bread as opposed to powdery flour that obviously isn't going to take in water. And are you the only person who's also talked about the
Yes,
ecosphere
that's funny.
in the
That's a
soil?
friend of mine, or I don't know, maybe I came up with it, but yeah. So, all right. So you can think about, healthy soil is spongy, and like a loaf of bread, because there's life in it. Just like bread has yeast, there's life, and that creates it creates a structure, and you have pore spaces for water to kind of move through and soak in. But part of what makes that structure is this yucky stuff, is all the kind of gooey, carbon-based and fungal driven stuff, like sticky stuff that feeds other life forms and holds everything. Yeah, creates that structure. So yeah, that's the yuccosphere, right? Like the gooey, I'm trying to think, there's other words for gooey, but that's the main idea. And right, it all clumps
Yeah,
and
and it caused
coalesces, and
that
that's
clumping.
living soil. I mean, there's so much life in healthy living soil. Like all those microorganisms, like we only know like maybe 1 or 2% of the names or functions of these microorganisms. And the more we learn, just the more amazing stuff we find out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a whole world down there, and there's loads of questions coming in about changing mindsets and educating people. But because I know that we're very close to the end of our time, um, I thought that I might end with this quote from you, and I think this might sum it up. So this is in the section of your book where you're talking about what's been lost and the megafauna and the sheer mass of vegetation that's been lost. And as a human species, we look around and we see this as what is and what has been, and it's not necessarily what was, it's just what we're accepting today. And so then you say that efforts to restore biodiversity are as much about imagination as anything else. We need imagination in order to have hope, and we need hope in order to act. Now you've acted because you've written an inspiring book that also educates and takes people on this journey. But what was the hope and the picture that you had in your mind
Well, I
that
guess,
brought you to doing
there's a
that?
desire to share the wonder at how nature works. And once you start seeing and thinking about how healthy systems work, you become more aware, become more observant, you start to think about how you might be able to apply that in your own landscape. You perhaps growing food, it just connects you more with nature. And when you're more connected, you care. And I really think that loving the earth is about the most important thing that we can do, because we can't do anything if we don't care. And I guess curiosity, that just, I mean, I just wrote a whole book about efforts to restore the earth ecosystem by ecosystem, and went to a lot of other places around the world. But it really does come down so much to the soil, to promoting biodiversity, to building organic matter. And all of this depends on working with the water cycle. So it's all very basic once you start to really grasp it. And yeah, I guess I just hoped to stir people's imagination and curiosity, and to start looking around and to know what's possible, because we don't have to accept degraded landscapes. We don't have to accept constant brush fire, once we understand how nature managed those landscapes in a way that we did not have those fires. So yeah, just learning from nature, I think is really what I would just love for people to do, partly to solve the problems, but partly for their own joy and connection to the earth.
It's good hope. There's been a lot of activity in the chat on while we've been talking. Apart from the fact that I think everybody should race out and get your new book, The Reindeer Chronicles, and see more about, more of these fantastic stories that you have to tell. There are still more questions coming through. If people wanted to reach out to you with those
absolutely.
questions, is
through
there
my
any way
website,
that they can get in touch
there's
with
a
you?
really easy contact form, and I always respond. And just letting you and the Alliance know, I really, really want to be a resource any way I can. So know that I'm here. And yeah, check in with me because I know that people are looking for opportunities. And in fact, there's one chapter in the new book about a particular way, a consensus method that leads to transformation, and I actually witnessed it, and it was extraordinary. I mean, I watched a community in New Mexico go from people shooting each other. I mean, really, it's the Wild West, shooting each other, sabotage, fighting over water, to let's work to improve the land for everybody. It was incredible. So this method, the person who ran this workshop is giving free introductions online to this method. I mean, he wants more people to learn how to do this. So talk to me, write to me, and I will put you in touch.
I suggest absolutely everybody does that. I'm always in touch with you anyway, Judy. So
thank you.
So grateful for this. So grateful, and good luck with the new book. I know it's going to be another cracking one, just like this.